Western clothing brands are facing backlash and boycotts in China in response to the concerns the companies raised over alleged forced labor cotton practices in Xinjiang. Nike, H&M and Burberry are among the brands. The boycotts follow the imposition of tit-for-tat sanctions between some Western governments and China over so-called human rights issues in Xinjiang. What's driving these allegations? Daniel Dumbrill, a political commentator, argued in a 2-hour-long panel discussion about Xinjiang that the charges are hypocritical and have nothing to do with human rights concerns about Uyghurs or Muslim people in Xinjiang. The video has gone viral in China. So what did he say exactly? I'm pleased to be joined from Shenzhen by Daniel Dumbrill. Daniel, very much welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. I have been approached recently by quite a few media outlets, and this is the only one I chose to go on because the message that I had put out was intended for foreign audiences, and I feel like you guys have a pretty good base of foreign watchers.
You have participated in this panel discussion, as I say, part of which has gone viral. What was the panel about, and what main ideas did you talk about? What did you think triggered the huge reaction it has received so far, that even the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to air your piece, or that particular piece of your speech, during its daily presser?
Yeah, it received quite a big response in China, although it was made specifically to speak to the overseas kind of areas where people are kind of being tricked by this propaganda. It was actually kind of coincidental that we had this panel and then the sanctions, the more intense sanctions, happened on Xinjiang afterwards. So I think kind of everything aligned for it to become very popular. So that's one of the reasons it became popular. And the whole concept was around examining and tearing apart some of the claims, talking about what the true intentions are behind the U.S. Pushing this narrative and funding it very generously. Just about kind of, Xinjiang in general. So that went on for, 2.5 hours. And by the time it came out, as I said, it came out just in time for the sanctions.
What did you mainly talk about? I mean, that particular monologue you gave, what was the main idea in it?
Well, so the main idea was talking about the nature of the claims, how it doesn't really, a lot of the claims don't really hold up, how they fall apart when you question them with even, remotely logical questions. But also one important thing is that it talked about how you are not able in the West to really question it. The moment you question it, even if you're not convinced one way or the other, people call you a genocide denier. They really discourage you from standing in the middle while you figure this out. I think the same thing happened with the MPs in Canada when they voted on calling the situation in Xinjiang a genocide. They knew that they had to vote that way, that the public had been propagandized into believing this. And, compassion has been weaponized, and everybody's going to kind of fall in line. I think that's a good time to be scared because we've seen this kind of a thing before. Not only in terms of narratives being manufactured, whether it be weapons of mass destruction or other, false flag events, whatever they may be, but the problematic language that was used during that time as well, when George Bush said, you're either with us or against us. You cannot stand in the middle. You either have to be completely on board with us or you're our enemy. And you kind of see the same kind of a thing going on with this. I think that part of it struck home with a lot of people who in the West do want to question this. That's perhaps why it became popular with some groups overseas as well. Yeah.
Well, you talked about some of the holes, which some of what's being said about Xinjiang, you said that doesn't stand. That is very easy if you look at it from a logical way, it just doesn't add up together. Could you give one or two examples about these allegations in Xinjiang?
Yeah, from a just the perspective of living here in China. So, living here in China, I mean, I know Uyghur people as well. If you just look at the fact that the Uyghur population is outgrowing the Han Chinese population, in part because they were never subject to the one-child policy, the fact that they can enter into universities with lower scores than everybody else, basically an affirmative action kind of a program. Halal foods are prepared for them in the cafeterias at these universities. The script, the Uyghur script is written on all of the cash in China. I mean, this is something we don't even do for our native populations in Canada. So it's not only a matter of, sometimes people point to, well, the biggest star in China is also a Uyghur as well. Some people think those are superficial arguments, but when you look at the whole picture, it really doesn't add up. I don't think to be clear, I don't think the situation is perfect. I think, after 2008, there was a racial profiling issue. There were some Uyghurs who were being refused access to hotels and things like that. And that's something even Chinese media wrote about, saying we shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. But even aside from that, having their documents checked more in airports and things like that. But the thing is that's a racial profiling issue, and it's wrong. But if the U.S. was going to have an honest question, an honest conversation about this, in terms of pointing at racial profiling issues in China, they wouldn't have a leg to stand on. I mean, this is not something they've even figured out on their own. And arguably, China's handled it better in many ways. If you look at the racial profiling that happened after 9/11, people were targeted in a major way in the U.S. as well. I mean, even if you had brown skin, you were at risk. There was a Sikh man who was killed in a gas station because he was mistaken as a Muslim. Mosques were being burned down. You would also go through increased security checks at the airport. It doesn't mean, this isn't a whataboutism to say then it's okay to racially profile here. I'm just saying that that's something they haven't even figured out. Where China did something different was during the time after that happened, Islamophobia was on the rise, and China came in and started censoring things that were overly Islamophobic. They tried to control this situation. Whereas in the West, they were free to say whatever they want, include spread rumors about people standing on building tops, waiting for the planes to hit buildings, which was completely false, which just kind of made the situation even worse for everybody.
Yeah. Well, in Xinjiang, we also have to remind people, or those who are not familiar with the situation, Xinjiang experienced a lot of terrorist attacks. So the security situation, of course, was much more stringent in that part of the world. And unfortunately, that is just what was necessary in order to, bring safety, bring security back to that place. But again, let's come back to what you said during the script, during your monologue. You also argue that Xinjiang issue, the so-called Xinjiang issue, is less about human rights for Western governments and more about ulterior motives. What kind of ulterior motives do you specifically mean? Can you help us understand that?
So I mean, the situation, definitely, you can see that this isn't really a universal care for Muslims overseas. I mean, in Canada, they are focusing on this so much with very shoddy evidence, while nobody has too much to say about the actual evidence we have from Australian SAS soldiers jumping out of their helicopters and shooting unarmed people face down in their fields that are holding their prayer beads. Nobody's really trying to hold the U.S. accountable for sanctioning the International Criminal Court members that wanted to look into the war crimes in Afghanistan. Nobody's saying anything about the men, the soldiers who were pardoned, who were serving, one of them was serving a life sentence for killing innocent people in a square in Iraq. So this isn't really about a care for Muslims. The U.S. obviously is funding a lot of money into this narrative. They funded overseas Uyghur groups millions of dollars since 2003. And immediately there, you've got to start to be a little bit suspicious about their intentions. Xinjiang is an oil-rich, mineral-rich region. Obviously, the National Petroleum Council in the U.S., who, interestingly enough, there was a vehicle in one of the recent Uyghur protests arranged by the American Uyghur Association, I believe it's called, where the vehicle, I looked up some of the license plates, and they were owned by executives at the National Petroleum Council. Whether that means something or not, I'm not sure. But this group did take a special interest in not only Xinjiang itself, but the surrounding region, saying that China is disrupting the Western dominance in the surrounding countries, both by having their own oil infrastructure there and also providing loans, which come with far less political requirements. I think what you're seeing here is not necessarily, though, an interest in the U.S. maintaining dominance over a specific oil-rich region like they do in their operations in the Middle East. This is more about maintaining global dominance. China's set to overtake America sooner than expected now. The digital renminbi could be challenging the US dollar soon. Many international settlements are being done in the renminbi. And resource-rich countries are increasingly choosing to work with China instead of the US. I mean, this is, China is kind of disrupting American global hegemony. And I don't think it's necessarily an intentional thing. It just so happens that they have better options. And so with that in mind, what I was hoping to see is that this would create a better world where maybe the US would start to come up with better options for these countries. But instead, it seems like they're more set on trying to disrupt China. And doing that through a region which is also very important to China's Belt and Road Initiative seems like a kind of a no-brainer. It seems like exactly the kind of thing they would do.
Yeah.
One of the things I mentioned in the talk as well is they delisted ETIM as a terrorist organization. That's a big red flag as well.
Yeah. You've said anytime America says they want to liberate a group of people, suspicion, at least in regard to the true intentions. Give us some more examples of the US raising tensions over human rights or democracy issues for serving geopolitical or, in your own words, imperialistic agendas?
Well, I mean, obviously the big ones were the weapons of mass destruction, manufacturing stories to excuse a conflict. Now, I think, though, I don't necessarily think this time the propaganda is necessarily meant to soften the public up for a physical confrontation. I think it's more about discrediting China on the international stage, getting countries to say, well, no, I wouldn't want to deal with a country like this. So I think, but the problem is, and my fear, and part of the reason that I'm making this content is I think we're getting to a very dangerous situation where it's just going to take one small spark or one mistake to snowball into an actual physical conflict, and potentially a conflict unlike anything we've ever seen before. So I think it's important for people to start asking these questions.
Among the allegations the Western countries have levied on China are those of genocide against Uyghur people, and that cotton from Xinjiang is produced by ethnic minority groups as forced labor. Why are these the predominant allegations, especially the cotton issue? Why has Xinjiang particularly been spotlighted, Daniel?
Well, I think the sanctions are designed to make people suffer. It's not only about affecting the government. They go into these countries and they put these brutal sanctions on them. Usually it's far more aggressive than what we're seeing in Xinjiang, where they're literally trying to block food and medicine supplies from going into the countries. And the point is to make the population dissatisfied, make them unhappy and want to rise up against their government. So I think with cotton being such a big industry in Xinjiang, it makes sense that they would target this. Their goal is not to help the Uyghur people. Their goal is to, again, make them discontent. Delisting ETIM as a terrorist organization, I truly believe that this ties into it as well. That's a very important move for them, because this not only removes scrutiny from ETIM, it allows them to begin to fundraise. When one of these organizations is put on a terrorist list, it prevents people from being able to donate to their organizations. So these people can mobilize more, and I think it all ties in together, where it's all about disrupting peace and harmony in Xinjiang. And these sanctions tie into that.
You were talking about the sanctions being designed to deny food or medicine to the people. As a devil's advocate here, some people would say, look, the sanctions were never designed to target specific people. For instance, in the case of Iran or DPRK, the US government always says the sanctions are there to hurt the government, right? They even spare basic medicine or food allowances so that people don't starve, but they want the so-called regime to change behavior. How do you react to that?
Well, I think it doesn't really, you don't actually see that happening, where they are still allowing essential things to get in. I mean, there was, I believe it was last year, there was a Mexican company that was sending fresh water to Venezuela. And, Venezuela had a water crisis at that, a clean water crisis at that point in time. And that Mexican company was sanctioned. I mean, these sanctions are designed to cut people off. and it works from the bottom up to have a people dissatisfied and want to rise up against their government. I think it's very clear with Sorry.
Okay. According to the Chinese Cotton Association's article, an article released by the Chinese Cotton Association on March the 25th, 70% of ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang are working in cotton production as their major source of income. And the Xinjiang cotton industry offers 600,000 jobs to the local people. But the Better Cotton Initiative, or BCI, the NGO that boycotts Xinjiang cotton for alleged forced labor, has registered more than 2,000 brands. If these brands stop sourcing from Xinjiang, it will affect the job opportunities for these 600,000 people, more or less. So how do you look at the action and the words of the BCI, and what do you think is their aim?
Well, so I think I'm still kind of looking into the BCI situation and who they're tied to. There's a bunch of really interesting articles coming out.
The USaid is listed as one of their income sources.
Exactly. So I mean, I think there's some personal benefit here. These are wins on multiple angles, because again, as you mentioned, the number of people who are employed by this industry, it's the perfect target if your goal is to disrupt a region or to make a people's whose livelihoods and living conditions are continually improving, finding a way to disrupt that somehow. I think, in terms of I believe one of the key reasons why terrorism was able to be controlled so well as well is because so much effort was put into Xinjiang to create opportunities for people so that they don't kind of fall down these kinds of pathways, and creating job opportunities and all of these kinds of things ties into that. So if the U.S. wants to disrupt that, of course, they would have to kind of attack that infrastructure. Taking away jobs from ordinary Uyghurs will definitely be a part of that. The ironic thing, of course, is also that I now see China watchers talking about how Uyghurs are traveling further and further away from home to find work, which is a system set up deliberately to kind of push along this cultural genocide of sorts, without any sense of irony that they're actually compounding this issue by taking away their jobs at home.
Stepping back a little bit, exactly what do you think is driving the Western narrative about Xinjiang? Is there ideological differences, economic interests, geopolitical interests, or different mentality between civilizations even?
Well, I think it's definitely a geopolitical game as far as I can see. Obviously there's a lot of money being funded into this, but I don't think all of the people pushing this narrative are necessarily funded. And so I've engaged with a lot of people who are pushing this narrative forward, including people who say they have missing family members and things like that. So I think for the people who aren't funded, who are joining along for this, you have to understand and look at what they're doing. If you see the Australian MPs who are pushing this issue forward as well, when they have Uyghur people standing behind them, they're waving the East Turkestan flag. They're waving the blue flag. These people are not looking for better conditions for Uyghurs in China. They're a small group of separatists that want Xinjiang to separate from China, and many of them want to create an Islamic state of their own. Of course, the U.S.'s interest at that point would be that this Islamic state would be well aligned with them, and play ball with them in their kind of Cold War against China. But nobody really cared about a Xinjiang separatism issue before. But now there's this issue where a lot more people care about Xinjiang now on the basis of human rights. So I think naturally you get people all of a sudden whose primary target is to separate Xinjiang from China, jumping onto this. And all of a sudden they also have missing family members that they, suddenly became missing after this narrative was funded. Of course, so I've interacted with some of them and pointed out holes in a lot of the narratives they were saying about who was missing, what their age was, and the details. Usually I get blocked after that. But CGTN also has gone out and found some of these people in their workplaces, and they're saying, I have no idea why these people are making these lies about me. Now, of course, critics outside of China will say, well, you can't trust CGTN because it's a government mouthpiece. But these are the same people who are quoting reports from ASPI, Australia Strategic Policy Institute, a think tank funded by the military-industrial complex that manufactures, the think tank manufactures China threat stories. Then afterwards profit from China threat prevention, to sell missiles and military equipment to countries like Australia. So they're willing to listen to that. They don't care about the conflict of interest there, but they're not willing to listen to anything from China.
How do you see the role of prominent mainstream media in the West? For instance, all of these stories, all of these allegations that we talked about have been promulgated by the BBC or CNN, and they report on these as if these are what's really happening on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely an important tool to push this forward. You know, whether it's under direct direction or not, I'm not sure. But these stories sell. People want to hear these stories, and so you see everybody jumping on board. I mean, you see, you know, BBC propped up the story of one of the supposed concentration camp survivors, Tursunay. And retweeted that story 7 times in a 24-hour period. It then went on over to CNN. And there's no honest journalism going on behind this. Nobody mentioned that she's on the 3rd version of her story. You know, CNN even went as far as blurring out the passport issue date when they showed a picture of her passport. And that was really odd. But the reason is, of course, because that's a massive hole in her story.
Why do you think this is a very important detail? Yeah. Why do you think
if you look at her testimony, if you look at her testimony that was uploaded to the Xinjiang victims database, she was under house arrest during the time that her passport was renewed. I mean, that would have been impossible. She wouldn't have been able to renew her passport. Why would China even renew somebody's passport if they really were doing this to her to begin with? And then her story also included that her visa for the neighboring country that she was going into was about to expire, which is impossible also because it was a brand new passport she had in her hands. I mean, this is some basic fact checking. CNN could have seen this, could have exposed this, but instead, what they did was they blurred up that massive hole in her story and didn't even mention it. So I don't know what's going on or how they're incentivized to do this dishonest journalism, but it's most definitely dishonest journalism.
You have argued passionately about this issue, but for the sake of the argument, how do you base your arguments on facts? What kind of research have you conducted, and how long have you been working on these research so that you are sure what you're saying really is based on facts for the skeptics of your arguments?
Well, so the facts of what's going on in China are obviously observable and verifiable in terms of what I was mentioning about not being subject to the one-child policy. I mean, there's not too far from me, there's a Muslim family who owns a restaurant. I have regular conversations with them. They send their child to learn Arabic characters at the local mosque. So a lot of it is just based on personal knowledge, but also, as I mentioned, engaging with some of the people making these claims, all of a sudden who have missing family members, and saying there's a real big problem here. And the reaction I've been getting, though, is from a lot of people. I think a lot of people who believe this story, they know there's a lot of lies mixed in. And what they usually say is, well, okay, all right, so you've exposed a bunch of lies here, but you know, even if only 10% of it is true, we have a big problem to worry about. And I have a feeling that propagandists know this and they capitalize on it. They'll put 1,000 stories out. They don't care how ridiculous they are, because they only need you to believe 100 of them. You know, when in fact what people should be doing is saying, why is this narrative filled with so many lies and so many liars? You know, why, you know, but instead they're taking the approach saying, okay, like I said, even if 10% is real, they still want something done about it. So it's been, you know, interacting with people. I've interviewed people on my channel as well who are completely on the opposite side of the fence. I interviewed a Uyghur activist who coincidentally used to be a translator for the interrogation team in Guantanamo Bay, interrogating Uyghurs. Now she has her own NED-funded NGO. I had her on my show, talking to her and, you know, again, catching her in lies about how long she was funded by the NED. She left out that in 2013, her funding already started then. I interviewed another person, you know, a guy named Arslan in Turkey. And he said that his father-in-law, because he's married to a Uyghur woman from Xinjiang, his father-in-law is missing, has been taken by the government, and he's a famous actor. So I engaged him and asked him about some of the misleading stuff that he posted. And after the interview, I found out that his father-in-law is still making commercials and enjoying his life here, and that he blocked Arslan on WeChat. So it was a matter of just continually engaging with the other side. I think that, when you approach something like this, you have to actively look for things to prove yourself wrong. And that's what I've done, and I've just noticed all of these different holes.
You mentioned two examples in your video which are very ironic. One is that 80 Canadian Parliament members you reached out to refuse to have conversations with you on why and how they confidently passed the motion radically labeling Xinjiang policies as genocide. And your father was labeled a genocide denier in an academic forum for questioning the intention behind the Xinjiang narratives. What do these examples signal to you, and why do you think you're not having a voice?
Well, yeah. So again, it's a weaponization of compassion. It's saying that this is something that you need to pay attention to. They have a phrase that people like to remember, which is a very important phrase, which is called "never again." And obviously, they think that if what was going on in Germany is happening here, everybody needs to stand up against it. But what people are not asking the "never again" about is never again should we be fooled by fake propaganda that excused aggressions, whether it be the weapons of mass destruction story or the fake testimony from the 14-year-old Kuwaiti girl that ended up being completely fake about babies being thrown from incubators. She had a very convincing story that she told crying in front of the camera. And so I think people are too focused on that. And you also have to think that from an MP's point of view, if they aren't fully equipped with all of this information, the consequences of voting yes on the motion to call what was going on in Xinjiang a genocide, and later finding out that they were wrong, it was just a giant propaganda campaign, the consequences are far less than if they voted no and then later found out that a genocide actually was going on. So from their point of view, without being equipped with the right information, I mean, of course, they'd go with the safe bet. They'd go with yes. From what I understood afterwards, also from people very well connected with the government, is that people were pressured by their parties to vote in that direction. And at bare minimum, if they didn't want to vote on it, they should abstain and just not vote on it at all. And that's why you saw a unified vote on the matter. But I mean, if I was a member of parliament and my constituents were convinced by this amazing propaganda effort that this was really going on, I'd have a really difficult time speaking out against it as well.
Yeah, Daniel, finally, what gets you motivated to speak up for China, very often in defense of the government or of the party even? What do you think of what you're doing?
Well, yeah. So I mean, my defense is a defense for the truth, and so it's multi-layered. I obviously got involved with the Hong Kong topic before. There was a side of the story that wasn't being told at that point, so I wanted to tell that story. Just because, again, I don't think these aggressions should be excused with, having no aggressions at all would be great, but especially when it's being pushed forward by fake stories. I think that's something really important to fight back against and to offer balance in the other direction. I think there's another component as well. There are overseas Chinese people who are being targeted as well. And a lot of people don't want to draw the conclusion that anti-China propaganda leads to anti-Asian racism, but it seems pretty clear by some of the rants that some people have gone on against Chinese people that that absolutely is the case. And for Chinese people overseas, maybe they're even becoming convinced of this narrative that's being pushed forward by these propaganda outlets. So I know what that does to identity as well. If all of a sudden they're ashamed of being Chinese. So I think, my kids are half Chinese as well. There's plenty of them to be proud of in terms of what China's doing. And so pushing back against that and giving some of these people a bit of hope as well was part of it in the beginning. But right now, the biggest thing is kind of trying to avoid a war because it really is getting to a scary point at this moment.
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you have been doing, and keep up the good work. That was Daniel Dumbrill joining us from Shenzhen, China. And with that, we are coming to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.